Stephen, I was told that the Sumerians had a counting system based on 6. And when you talk about 6 fingers and 6 toes, I go, maybe there's something to that. Did you know that?
Yes, and interestingly enough, when you see the Sumerian king that's seated on his throne in the standard stele, or basically the bas-relief, if you notice him, he's got very slender legs, and if he were to stand up, he would overtower by a factor of at least 2 to 1 the guys that are serving him. It's the standard Sumerian seals inscription. So, interestingly enough, when you look at the Sumerian pantheon, you know, it's been stated that even, George, this will blow your mind, even in the halls of the military and the Pentagon, when they encounter unidentified flying objects of a specific kind, they refer to them as the gods of the Sumerians returning.
That does blow my mind.
Yeah, and I mean, Liz, how about this? You know, everybody knows Buffalo Bill Cody, interesting, colorful figure from the West. Now, here's just kind of like a really interesting little snippet, okay? The North American Indians believe that the first race of human beings were giants. And interestingly enough, in a story in the autobiography of Buffalo Bill Cody, Cody writes that while camping on the South Platte, a Pawnee Indian came into the camp with what the Army surgeon pronounced to be a giant thigh bone of a human being. Asked about where such a bone might have come from, the Indian replied that long ago a race of giants had lived in the area. The race of men had been, according to the stories handed down by the tribe, 3 times larger than normal men. And listen to this, and were able to outrun a buffalo and even carry it once they captured the creature. Now, that might sound unbelievable to some people, but then you can actually go into the Roman historians who talk about Maximinius, that's the guy I referred to earlier. Listen, he could outpull a chariot with a team of horses, and he's the guy that was so big, he could outrun a horse at full gallop.
Well, a horse goes at a 30-mile-an-hour clip.
You got it. So, you know, you take the standard stride of a normal man, and you get the feeling. By the way, this Maximinius had a phenomenal appetite. He ate 40 pounds of meat a day and drank 6 gallons of wine. and see, these are what are interesting in the book, and I want to share with people. In the book, I've documented over hundreds and hundreds of hundreds. Literally, I'm approaching 800 or 900 different incidents of the giants in history. And not only with the anecdotes, but with just who wrote it, where they wrote it. And if you want to understand that, when you look at the history, for instance, of the Aztecs, Incas, and Mayas, the Aztecs had their god Quetzalcoatl, which was a giant that came from the east. It's why the conquistadors were able to conquer Montezuma, because he was looking for the prophecies. And these guys were big, they were smart. And this is, if you go to Viracocha, you go just down the coast, basically, from Mexico into South America, and you get into the Mayans, and then you get into the Incas. It's fascinating. They all inherited giant cities that they did not build.
Steve, take us back to the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve. Were they giants, or were they about our size?
Well, basically, interesting, there's a French book called Les Giants, and forgive my French, but they claim that Adam and Eve were much taller, around 7 to 8 feet. Now, again, we got to separate between, let's say this, normally larger people, and obviously everything from gravity to a different density of the atmosphere would have affected that. But what I'm talking about, the supernatural, the Nephilim, in other words, the fallen angel. And by the way, George, you know, we talked about it. Nowhere in the Old Testament do sons of God refer to normal people. In the book of Job, it's always the Benai Elohim, and you know, Sitchin and others have stretched that to mean the Anunnaki. It means literally the angels, and it talks about them being able to basically shape-shift. And every obelisk, let me tell you something that's kind of interesting. Every obelisk in history, they're found throughout the world, all, and when I say this, I don't mean to sound like a pun, but it points to the fact that the angels were able to take on themselves, you know, human sexual features and procreate. Some people have a really hard time with that, but every time you see an obelisk, even the one in Washington, that's what the real history of it is. It's not just, oh, gee, this is a nice monument. It's absolutely commemorating the fact that a specific group of angels, and, you know, interestingly enough, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found at Qumran, the Book of Enoch, which is what's called a pseudepigraphal work, even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it backs up so much of what Genesis 6 and other passages in the Old Testament teach, and some people just absolutely cannot handle that.
Well, how many giants, percentage-wise, of the population, not total number, but percentage-wise, do you think inhabited the planet back in the biblical days?
Well, that's a good question because, you've got Joshua and Caleb who took over leading the Hebrews out of Egypt into the Promised Land. Pretty much everybody they encountered, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, everybody, the Zanzamim, everybody that they encountered was a giant. So I would say this, that when you're talking about the area of Canaan, when you're talking about the Middle East, I would say based on what I've been able to determine, pretty much 50 to 60% of who they encountered were giants. And they all, it's interesting because in Joshua, he's talking about the spies that went into the Promised Land, and they said it's a horrible land, for the land devours its inhabitants. In other words, when the giants couldn't satisfy their appetite, and this is true throughout the world, when they could not be fed enough, that's when they started eating people. And it's fascinating because the history of cannibalism, I don't want to sound gruesome, but is directly related and traceable to the giants.
Well, if 50% of the population happened to have been giant in those days, why is that percent way down now to a point of probably less than 1%?
Well, I think a couple things. Number one, it's important to understand that and every listen to this, every continent, every place, it seems like the giants ended up fighting. I mean, we're talking about battles with the Romans where 200,000 and 300,000 of these giants were killed in a single battle. Those are big battles, okay?
Huge battles.
Huge battles. And again, I think the problem with most people is that history has become dull and boring, and if you watch, Jay Leno, and he goes out on the man in the street, and, most people can't even place the continents any longer. I mean, when I'm sure you've been amazed, George, haven't you, at the people being asked just basic, simple questions, and they get this kind of, starry-eyed glare into the world, and they can't answer the simplest of questions. I'm saying that to say this, that obviously I think history is rich with answers, and I think the skeptics are out there because, quite candidly, people have failed to take up their challenge to be able to answer a lot of these situations. Look, in the Temple of Saqqara in Egypt, you have absolute hieroglyphics that you cannot get away from that are unusual in the fact that, they look like Cobra helicopters. David Hatcher Childress, goodnight, Graham Hancock, Robert Bivall, John Anthony West. Some of these guys are phenomenally brilliant. Graham Hancock's gotten a lot of heat, but he's probably one of the smartest people in the world. And when he's gone and done his stellar projections, each and every one of the, like the Great Pyramid of Giza and everything, and they line up with stellar coordinates that are back 12,500 years old.
Assuming, though, Stephen, all this is correct,
right,
that we did have in those days many, many giants of unbelievable height. I think at one point Edgar Cayce believed that those from Atlantis were extremely tall. Ridiculously tall. But assuming all this is correct, your work is correct, what does that mean? What's the bottom line here with giants?
The bottom line is they're coming back. The bottom line is their DNA has already been cultivated. There are laboratories that this thing is, how do I say this? This thing is of, no pun intended, but of biblical proportion in the ramification, We're talking about a lot of things happening. As you know, before Malachi Martin died, and Art did the phenomenal interview he did with Father Malachi Martin, Malachi Martin made a statement. He said, imagine the very worst thing you can think of, and then multiply it by, what do you say, 100 or 1,000 times?
Yes.
And that's how bad it's going to get. There has been a real attempt, especially by certain elements within the Catholic Church, to withhold the third secret of Fatima. We're talking about the giants coming back. We're talking about genetic engineering experiments. We're talking about things like the soul catcher chip. Have you ever heard about the soul catcher chip?
I have not heard that one. Tell me about that.
What the soul catcher chip is, okay? It's basically developed by British Telecom, and the chip is to be implanted behind the eye, and where it records, listen to this, George, every waking moment of a person's experience. According to the researchers developing the chip, this information will then be combined with cloning techniques to create a duplicate of the original person. Now listen to this, quoting. He said, this is the end of death. By combining this information with a record of the person's genes, we could recreate a person physically, emotionally, and spiritually. I would challenge that. An implanted chip would be like an aircraft's black box and would enhance communications beyond current concepts, he said. For example, police would be able to use it to relive an attack, rape, or murder from the victim's viewpoint to help catch the criminal. Now we've got the British announcing, what was it, I think 10 days ago, that they've now identified a gene that's common to criminals.
Yes.
It's kind of like the movie with Tom Cruise, where now they're going to have a committee for pre-crime. And so what's interesting about this is that a lot of people used to snicker at the longevity recorded in the Bible. Methuselah, 969 years old. Enoch, 365 years. So when you start to understand that the genetic altering, and one of the things I get asked all the time, and this is a great question, I think it's a fabulous question, did the ancient Egyptians have reason to believe that there would come a time when they could be reconstituted? May I read you the interesting thing from the British Museum?
Yes, you may.
Because this blew my mind, okay? And it's interesting because, again, we're talking about Ramesses II, one of the most famous pharaohs of Egypt, and it's fascinating that when we talk about this stuff, people say, well, they can't be doing that. Listen to this. This is from CNN Egypt. For decades, the mummified remains of Ramesses II have rested in the Cairo Museum and hauled out occasionally for the viewing pleasure of visiting dignitaries. Like his fellow pharaohs, Ramesses wanted nothing more than live for eternity. Now, some 3,000 years later, some observers speculate that maybe the ancient Egyptians, with their determination to preserve their bodies, were not so much prone to wishful thinking as they were thinking ahead. Reports that Scottish scientists have cloned an adult sheep named Dolly. Goes on to say, the question is whether such DNA could be cloned so the great Ramesses or perhaps Seti I or even King Tutankhamun rise again and have life after death they so desperately craved. And it goes on to basically say that, this is already being considered,
Well, Stephen, you seem to imply, and let me tell you, when I first interviewed you many months ago on terrorism, you scared the heck out of me. And the problem is I think you were right. You seem to imply that there's something going on here with DNA and giants. Who's doing this?
Well, obviously, and I believe that there is a group in the background, call them what you will, but there is a group in the background that's similar to the Third Reich that wanted to produce a Superman, or the Aryans, okay? And interestingly enough, that given how would I say this, and again, obviously we're dealing in a world that's not just carnal, if you will, or physical, but that has a spiritual element in it. We're dealing with now, if you will, looking at every single headline in the paper. It's like the four horsemen of the apocalypse are on a full gallop. I believe that what we're going to see is basically just as in the days of Noah. And what people don't understand is in the days of Noah, all this really wicked and strange stuff was going on. I think we're getting ready to see it again in an unfathomable application to contemporary events.
Do you believe, without a shadow of a doubt, that giants were the offspring of extraterrestrials who came to this planet?
If you mean by extraterrestrials, I believe that angels were, and I believe in literal biblical angels, that basically had their own realm of being. In Greek, there's a word called oikaterion, which means, in essence, their place, their dwelling place, or their, if you will, boundaries. I believe they left the boundaries that God had given to them, and that they basically mixed with the seed of women, producing this offspring. And I think that it's going to happen again, because what's happening is in Noah's day, the whole earth was filled with violence. And let's face it, this isn't a land of peace and love. I'm not only saying this land, but things are not getting, in my opinion, more sedate or more mellow. They're building towards a climax. So to answer your question, I believe that what is commonly called the aliens, or as Zechariah Sitchin writes about the Anunnaki, are definitely fallen angels. So they would be extraterrestrials, but they would almost be extra-dimensionals.
Aren't fallen angels, Stephen, like the devil?
Well, the devil was actually a cherub, and there are different groups of heavenly beings. Let me give you a good example. One of the most interesting, if you will, windows into the past is the book of Enoch. Enoch was a guy that, in Genesis, very little is said about him, that he walked with God and was not, for God took him. Two guys that didn't die were Elijah and Enoch. The point being, as Enoch wrote or is attributed to writing the Book of Enoch, but there were also other volumes that have disappeared. There are people like myself that believe the Vatican has them and won't release them, okay? And it's interesting that you have in the Book of Enoch a whole a panorama of not only the past but also the future. And the future in the Book of Enoch is one that's pretty gruesome until God ultimately puts down evil. So I believe there is a battle between good and evil, and I believe that people should realize that if I want to keep you in the matrix, I'm going to provide you all the data and all the imagery that will support the matrix. Once you get outside of the data and imagery beyond the matrix, you find out, hey, somebody's been lying to me. And that's why I wrote this book. And again, it's 480 pages, George, 30 years of stuff. And people may not accept everything, but if they want to be blown away by what really went on in history, I would encourage them to do that. And by the way, on my website, there's a chart. I don't know if you've gone to it, but go to my website, stevequayle.com, and then look on the chart, and you'll see how tall 36-foot guys are in proportion to 6-foot guys.
Yeah, I saw that.
And what's interesting, now obviously their arms would be bigger, their heads would be bigger, and anything. That's just for relative size. And if you think about it again, you've got guys who are writing, from the Middle East. And have you noticed this week, too, that it seems like, well, actually in the last couple weeks, more flying saucers, more...
Oh, it's huge. They're all over the place.
They're all over the place. And so I maintain that obviously there's going to be, if you will, a dialectic setup where, the, quote, space brethren are here to save us from ourselves, kind of like the day the Earth stood still.
Yes.
And the point being is that there's a very sinister side to this. And the very sinister side to this is the fact that humanity is expendable, and it's kind of like, do you remember seeing an old Twilight Zone where an alien comes with supposedly the book to save everybody?
It's called To Serve Man. That's the name of the Twilight Zone.
Being lunch.
My very favorite Twilight Zone episode. You brought it up.
And basically what I'm saying is that we're seeing the same thing being enforced. By the way, again, it seems like, unfortunately, this is something that's coming back on the scene. And let me make a distinction because I think this is important, and maybe we have to get to it in the second half of the show, but there is a distinction between a demon and a fallen angel, okay? A demon is a disembodied spirit. The giants, when they died, that which was born of heaven and earth, those spirits were what became the demons. They have appetites, and they all have one thing in common. You know what it is? They hate mankind.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So, this is fascinating stuff. And someone says, well, how does this fit into 20th century technology? The technology of the ancients so surpasses what we have now. The point is that we're all technologically egotistical and think, oh, boy, we got this, we got that. We don't even hold a candle to some of the things that have gone before us, because in the Book of Enoch, it talks about the supernatural intelligence of the fallen angels being given over to mankind to basically, enable us to kill all ourselves off.